The porch light is on. It has been on all night, a fact that Marian Eccles noticed at 6:40 on the morning of February 11th, 1987, when she pulled back the curtain above her kitchen sink in the town of Winslow Hollow, Vermont, population 1,100, and saw the yellow glow burning across the road in the gray pre-dawn. The Hargrove house always went dark by 9. Harold and Eunice Hargrove were in their 70s and kept the kind of hours that people who have spent a lifetime waking before sunrise tend to keep. Marian had been their neighbor for 16 years. She knew their rhythms the way you know the weather when you have lived somewhere long enough. She poured her coffee. She looked again. The porch light was still on. At 7:15 a.m., when the sky had come up enough to see clearly, Marian walked across the road and knocked on the Hargroves' front door. The knock went unanswered. She tried the handle. The door was unlocked. She opened it 2 inches and called Harold's name into the warmth of the house. The smell of burnt coffee reached her from somewhere inside. She stepped back, closed the door, walked to the end of the driveway, and stood in the cold for a moment. Then she went home and called the Winslow Hollow constable. What had happened inside that house in the hours before Marian crossed the road would take 28 years, 2 generations of investigators, and a genealogy database that did not exist yet to finally answer. But before any of that, we have to go back to the beginning of February 1987 and to the 2 people who had lived inside that house for more than 4 decades. Because to understand what was taken from Winslow Hollow that winter, you first have to understand who Harold and Eunice Hargrove were. Winslow Hollow sat in the northeast kingdom of Vermont, up near the Canadian line, where the winters arrived in November and didn't fully release until April, and the sugarbush season in between was the event the whole community organized itself around. The town had a general store, a congregational church, a volunteer fire department, and a school that ran kindergarten through 8th grade before the children were bused to the regional high school 12 miles south. Everyone knew everyone's name, and most people knew everyone's business, which was not considered an intrusion, but simply the natural condition of living in a place that small. Harold Hargrove had farmed the same 43 acres on County Road 9 since 1951, when he came back from Korea with a Bronze Star and a bad left ear, and bought the property for cash with money he had saved, working on his uncle's dairy operation in Caledonia County. He grew hay and kept a small herd of beef cattle and served on the select board for 11 years, and was the sort of man who showed up to help someone move without being asked and never mentioned it afterward. His neighbors described him as steady. In Winslow Hollow, that was the highest compliment available. Eunice had grown up 12 miles south in Lyndonville, the daughter of a school principal who had given her an education and a stubbornness that Harold said he admired and sometimes regretted in equal measure. She had taught Sunday school at the Congregational Church for 30 years, organized the town's Maple Festival for a decade and a half, and kept a kitchen garden that people drove past slowly in August to look at. She made a rhubarb jam that she gave in labeled jars every Christmas, and which the recipient families rationed carefully through the following year. Their daughter, Nora, lived in Burlington with her husband and 2 children, and drove up on the last Sunday of every month without fail. She had spoken to her mother by phone on the evening of February 10th, a Tuesday, at around 8:30. Eunice had sounded fine. They'd talked about whether Nora's older boy was going to try out for the spring soccer team. They talked about a quilt Eunice was finishing. Eunice said Harold had gone to bed early with a headache and she was about to follow. She said she loved Nora. Nora said she loved her back. That was the last time they spoke. That Tuesday night was the last ordinary night the Hargrove house would ever have. Constable Dale Foss arrived at the Hargrove property at 7:52 a.m. On February 11, 1987, he found the front door unlocked, as Marian had. He entered the house and conducted a walkthrough. He found the kitchen in apparent order, except for a percolator on the stove that had boiled dry, likely sometime in the night, which was the source of the burnt smell Marion had noticed. The back door, which opened from the kitchen onto a narrow mudroom, was also unlocked. The storm door on the mudroom had not been fully latched and was moving in the wind. Harold and Eunice Hargrove were found in the rear bedroom of the house. Both were deceased. The Vermont State Police Major Crimes Unit arrived from St. Johnsbury by noon. The lead detective assigned to the Hargrove case was Sergeant Paul Audette, 44 years old, a 16-year veteran of the state police who had worked homicides in Chittenden County before transferring north. Paul Audette was thorough and unhurried, and the people who worked with him said he had a quality that was hard to name precisely, a kind of refusal to be satisfied with the obvious explanation, a habit of asking one more question after everyone else had stopped. The scene told him several things immediately. The percolator had been running when something interrupted the evening. There were 2 cups on the kitchen table, Harold's with coffee still in it, Eunice's empty, and pushed to one side, suggesting they had been sitting together in the kitchen at some point before bed. The back door's unlocked state and the unlatched storm door were anomalies in a household where Marion Eccles later confirmed both Harold and Eunice were meticulous about locking up at night, always, without exception, because Harold had grown up in a house that was burglarized when he was 12 and had never fully lost the habit of checking the locks. Someone had come through that back door. On the mudroom floor, partially obscured by a rubber boot mat, Paul Audette found a single work glove. Dark green canvas with a rubber palm. Men's large. It did not belong to Harold Hargrove. Court documents would later confirm that Paul Audette photographed it, bagged it, and logged it in the evidence inventory on the same afternoon he arrived. It was the first thing he logged, and the thing he came back to most in the years ahead. The Vermont medical examiner confirmed within 72 hours that both Harold and Eunice had died as the result of criminal acts. The investigation was now a double homicide. Nora Hargrove drove up from Burlington in the afternoon of February 11th, having been reached by phone at her workplace at 11:30 that morning. She was 43 years old, and she sat in the constable's station for 2 hours answering questions in the careful, suspended way that people answer questions when they are still waiting for the information to become real. She told Paul Audette that her parents had no enemies she was aware of, that her father kept a small amount of cash in a coffee tin in the pantry, but that the tin was not there for burglary reasons. He just didn't trust banks for everyday money. Never had. She did not know if anything was missing from the house. She could not go back in yet. Paul Audette checked the pantry. The coffee tin was there, undisturbed. The early investigation moved quickly in some directions and stopped completely in others. State police canvassed every residence within 2 miles of the Hargrove property and interviewed 43 people in the first 10 days. A traveling appliance repair technician named Robert Glover had been seen in Winslow Hollow that Tuesday, working a service call at a farmhouse half a mile from County Road 9. He drove a panel van and was not from the area and could not immediately account for his whereabouts after 5 o'clock. He became the investigation's first significant focus. Paul Audette spent 6 weeks on Robert Glover. He was thorough about it. He requested Glover's service records, phone logs, and the statements of every customer Glover had visited in the Northeast Kingdom that month. He found 2 witnesses who placed Glover at a diner in Newport at 7:15 Tuesday evening, nearly an hour's drive from Winslow Hollow, and confirmed a motel check-in receipt in Newport at 8:45 the same night. The timeline didn't fit. Glover was cleared in late March. The green work glove from the mudroom was sent to the FBI laboratory in Quantico for analysis. In 1987, the science of forensic DNA profiling was barely 2 years old and not yet admissible in Vermont courts. The lab returned a report noting the glove contained trace biological material, but that the technology to develop a usable profile from it did not currently exist. The glove was returned to the Vermont State Police Evidence Facility in Waterbury. It was logged. It was sealed. It went into storage. Paul Audette noted in his case file that the glove was the best thing they had. He intended to return to it. He wrote himself a reminder in the margin of his investigation notebook. When the science catches up. Meanwhile, Nora had gone back to Burlington and was trying to figure out how to explain to her children, aged 9 and 12, that their grandparents were gone and that the person responsible had not been found. She drove up to Winslow Hollow on the first Sunday of every month, which was the day she had always visited. She let herself into the house, which she now owned, and sat at the kitchen table. She did not know what she was looking for. She sat anyway. The community gathered around her the way small communities do, with food first, and then with steady, quiet presence over time. Marion Eccles checked in every week for the first year. The Congregational Church held a memorial service in March that filled every pew. Harold and Eunice Hargrove had been in Winslow Hollow for 36 years. The grief was not abstract. By 1992, 5 years had passed with no arrest. Paul Audette had not closed the file. He had pursued 4 other persons of interest across those 5 years, each one investigated carefully and eliminated. The case had received attention from the Burlington Free Press in the first year and a half, 2 follow-up pieces in years 2 and 3, and then near silence after that, as unsolved cases tend to disappear from public view when there is nothing new to report. The reward that Nora had posted, $5,000, which was everything she had in savings at the time, had generated more than 60 tips in the first 2 years. Every one of them led nowhere. By 1995, Nora's children were in high school and college. The farmhouse on County Road 9 had been rented to a young couple from St. Johnsbury who were unaware of its history and planted tomatoes in the kitchen garden and were good tenants. Nora could not bring herself to sell it. She kept paying the property taxes. She drove up on the first Sunday of every month and sat in the driveway. By 2000, 13 years had passed. Paul Audette had retired from the state police in 1998, having never made an arrest on the Hargrove case. He kept a copy of his investigation notes. He kept the photograph of the green work glove, the original, the one he had taken on the first afternoon before the light faded, in a folder on the desk in his home office. He looked at it occasionally, not because he expected it to tell him something new, but because he didn't want to forget that it existed, that the answer was somewhere, that someone, somewhere had put on that glove and driven to Winslow Hollow on a February night in 1987 and was still alive, probably, and had never been held accountable. Nora's older son, David, turned 32 in 2007. He had become an accountant in Burlington. He told his wife that the thing he remembered most about his grandmother was the rhubarb jam, specifically the way Eunice wrote the labels in her careful schoolteacher handwriting. Always the same, always including the year. He had 1 jar left. He had not opened it. Every year, without fail, Nora Hargrove submitted a written request to the Vermont State Police Cold Case Unit asking whether there had been any new developments in the investigation. Every year, a detective in the unit sent a letter back confirming the case remained open and active. Most years, the letter was almost identical to the one from the year before. The case had been cold for 28 years, when, in the winter of 2015, Detective Corporal René Girard of the Vermont State Police Cold Case Unit attended a training seminar in Montpelier on forensic genealogy, a technique that had begun transforming cold case investigations across the country over the previous 3 years. She drove back to Waterbury the same afternoon and pulled the evidence log on the Hargrove case. She found the entry for the green work glove. She found the notation that the glove contained trace biological material, logged in 1987. She called the state evidence facility to confirm the glove was still in storage. It was. If this channel has ever given you a story worth staying for, a case that made you think, or remember, or refuse to let go, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from. It helps more than you know. Now, let's get back to René Girard and to that green work glove. On a Thursday morning in March 2015, Detective Corporal René Girard sat across a lab table from a forensic specialist at the Vermont Forensic Laboratory in Waterbury, with the green canvas work glove in an evidence bag between them. The glove was 28 years old. It had been in sealed storage for all of those years, which, the specialist explained, was the reason there was any reason to hope. Sealed, climate-controlled storage preserves biological material in ways that open-air environments cannot. The rubber palm had protected the inner surface of the glove from contamination better than expected. The process they were about to attempt is called forensic DNA genealogy, a method that extracts a DNA profile from trace biological material, uploads it to public ancestry databases, where ordinary people submit their own DNA to trace their family histories, and then traces the matches backward through family trees until the profile converges on a single individual or a small, verifiable group. The Golden State Killer case in 2018 would make this technique famous, but investigators in Vermont and a handful of other states had been quietly using earlier versions of it for several years before that. The lab extracted a workable DNA profile from the inner surface of the glove's palm on the second attempt. The profile was uploaded to 2 genealogy databases in April 2015. The results came back in June. René Girard was in her office when the email arrived. She read it once, quickly, and then printed it and read it again, sitting very still. There were 4 partial matches in the database. 4 people who shared enough genetic markers with the glove's profile to suggest they were related to the same individual within 2 to 3 generations. All 4 lived in New England. 3 of them had family trees traceable through Vermont County records, going back to the 19th century. She picked up the phone and called Paul Audette, who was 72 years old and gardening in St. Johnsbury when the call came through. "Paul," she said, "I think I have something." He said, "The glove?" She said, "The glove." He was in her office the following morning. The name that emerged from the genealogy analysis, after 6 weeks of cross-referencing family trees and eliminating individuals who did not fit the age range, geographic location, and other parameters of the 1987 investigation, was a man named Dennis Carrier. In February of 1987, Dennis Carrier had been 31 years old and living in Derby, Vermont, 22 miles northeast of Winslow Hollow. He had worked intermittently as a day laborer and odd jobs man throughout the Northeast Kingdom, which meant he was familiar with the back roads and the farm properties in the region, and it meant no one would have found it unusual to see an unfamiliar truck parked briefly on County Road 9. His connection to Harold Hargrove was not immediately obvious, but Paul Audette, reading through his own 28-year-old notes in René Girard's office in the summer of 2015, found it on page 31 of his second investigation notebook. In the early weeks of the case, Harold's neighbor 2 properties south had mentioned in passing that Harold had had a dispute the previous fall with a laborer he had hired briefly to help with hay billing, a young man whose name the neighbor couldn't recall, who Harold had let go after 2 weeks for what the neighbor described as trouble with honesty. The neighbor had not been followed up with. The note sat on page 31 for 28 years. A Vermont Department of Labor records search confirmed that Dennis Carrier had been paid by Harold Hargrove for 9 days of agricultural labor in September of 1986. 5 months before the February night, someone came through the Hargroves' back door. Dennis Carrier was 60 years old when Vermont State Police detectives arrived at his home in Newport in August of 2015. He had been living there for 11 years, working as a handyman, married with a stepson who played youth hockey. His neighbors described him as quiet and kept to himself, but was always willing to clear someone's driveway after a big storm. Nobody had ever had trouble with Dennis Carrier. A DNA swab was obtained under warrant. It matched the profile from the glove with a probability that the laboratory confirmed as greater than 1 in 700 billion. Dennis Carrier was arrested on the morning of August 19, 2015. At his home in Newport, Vermont, he was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He did not speak when the handcuffs went on. His wife stood on the front step of the house and watched him put into the back of the patrol car, and court records describe her as appearing unable to process what she was seeing, standing very still with her arms crossed against the August morning as if she were cold. At trial in 2016, the prosecution built its case on the DNA match, the labor records connecting Carrier to the Hargrove farm, and the testimony of Paul Audette, who walked the jury through 28 years of investigation in a calm, precise voice that the Burlington Free Press described afterward as carrying the weight of someone who had waited a very long time to say all of it out loud. Carrier's defense argued contamination and questioned the genealogy methodology. The jury was not persuaded. Dennis Carrier was convicted on both counts of first-degree murder on March 14, 2016. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without parole. He was taken from the courtroom without speaking. Nora Hargrove was 72 years old when the verdict came in. Her son David drove her to the courthouse in Burlington and sat beside her through all 4 days of the verdict proceedings. When the jury foreman read the verdict, Nora reached over and took David's hand and held it. And that was all. She had been submitting those annual letters to the Vermont State Police Cold Case Unit for 28 years. She had never stopped believing the case was open. She had been right. She drove to Winslow Hollow the following Sunday, as she always had, on the first Sunday of the month. She parked in the driveway of the farmhouse. The young couple who had rented it for years had long since moved on, and it had a new family now. A teacher and a carpenter with 3 children who had planted things in Eunice's kitchen garden the previous summer. Nora sat in the driveway for a while and then drove home. David opened the jar of rhubarb jam that spring. He said it was still good. He said he didn't know how that was possible after so many years, but it was. Eunice's handwriting on the label said, "Rhubarb, 1986. Paul Audette attended the trial every day." He was 72 years old, and his left knee had been bothering him for the better part of a decade, and he took the same seat in the gallery every morning, regardless. When Renee Girard asked him afterward what it felt like, he said he didn't have the right word for it. Then he said, the glove was always there. It was just waiting for the science. What stays with you about this case is not the arrest. It is not even the verdict. It is Marion Eccles, standing at her kitchen sink in the gray February morning, noticing that a porch light that should have been off was still on, and knowing, in the particular way that neighbors who have watched each other for 16 years know things, that something was wrong. She did not explain it or rationalize it. She crossed the road. She knocked. That small act of attention was the first link in a chain that ran from February 1987 to August 2015 to a courtroom in Burlington. And it began with one woman who paid close enough attention to notice that her neighbor's light was burning when it should have been dark. There are people like Marion Eccles in every community. The question worth sitting with is how many of them are standing at a kitchen window right now, noticing something small, and whether the systems around them will do what they should do with what they see. And what does it mean that the evidence that finally convicted Dennis Carrier had been sitting in a sealed storage facility in Waterbury for 28 years? That justice was never impossible? Only waiting for the moment when the tools matched the need? Tell us in the comments what you make of that. We want to know what this case means to you. Justice came for Harold and Eunice Hargrove after 28 years. Their story is why this channel exists, because no case is ever truly closed until someone refuses to stop asking. If you believe that, subscribe. More cases are waiting for you in the description below. Thank you for being here.